Okay, now I wanted to give you one more update, and that's an update on my nose. I got my biopsy results back. It turns out I don't have cancer. It's pre-cancerous. And so they said that you're going to give me a couple of months to heal, and then they're going to burn the rest of it off, freeze the rest of it off. I'm going to ask them to take a little off this side too, just to make it even. But hopefully next week I'll be able to come up here without the Band-Aid, and then you can see the pit that is left after such things get excavated. Questions? Okay, last time we were on the mutually exclusive example. And we had already calculated the IRR for the street corner lot, or for the ice cream, the snow cone stand. Does anyone remember what the IRR was?
23.375.
23.375%. Now, we said the discount rate for this project was 10%. Does IRR say to accept or reject the project? What's the rule for IRR?
Equal or greater to accept.
Yeah, if the IRR is greater than the discount rate. Because remember, if it's equal to, the NPV is 0. Should we ever take an NPV 0 project? No, you're just basically wasting your time. This reminds me, I need to tell you about when we're going to accept a negative NPV project. So if I could tell you to remind me. Okay, now what about the NPV here? NPV is how much?
24.3.
24.34. Do we accept or reject? We accept because the NPV is greater than 0. Now, before I forget, let me explain to you when we would accept a negative NPV project. The year was 1999. I'm working at a factory in Ohio. I'm the manufacturing engineering manager. And I get called up from my office out on the shop floor, and there's this guy at the front desk from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. Is it ever a good thing when no. And this little bald guy, he had his glasses on the end of his nose, and he says, "Are you the manufacturing engineering manager?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "I need to look at your paint process." I said, "Okay." By the way, when the government says, "I would need to look at your paint process," what do you say? "No way, man. That's a bad idea, right?" I'm like, "Okay." But of course I try to stall him, like, "Do you have your safety glasses?" He's like, "Yes." I said, "Do you have your steel-toe shoes?" He said, "Yes." He says, basically he's ready to go. So we go back there, and we're standing by the paint process, and he does this. He goes, "You look like a wild animal sniffing the air." Have you ever seen that? Okay. I'm like, "What the hell are you doing?" He says, "I'm sniffing for VOCs." I'm like, "What are VOCs?" He says, "Volatile organic compounds." I said, "Do you mean paint thinner?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, of course we use paint thinner. After all, it's a painting operation." He says, "You're not allowed to use that anymore." I said, "Why not?" And he says something like it's bad for the ducks. Whatever. Okay, so hey, I don't have anything against ducks, right? And so I'm like, well, you obviously seem to know what's going on in this particular realm. What is my alternative to using the paint with paint thinner? And he says you could try powder paint. I said, "What's powder paint?" He says, "It's little bitty tiny plastic particles, and you electrically charge your part, which is metal, you electrically charge it negative, you positively charge the powder particles, and then you spray it on them, and they stick." I'm like, "Well, isn't that going to rub off?" He says, No. After that, you run it through an oven, and it bakes it on there, and the plastic melts, and it looks like paint." I'm like, "Huh, I hadn't heard of that." And so I said, "Yeah, we'll take a look at that." He says, "See that you do." He says, "I'll be back in 60 days. What's he really telling me? I got 60 days to get my ducks in a row, right? Because it's for the ducks. I've got 60 days to, hopefully when he comes back, I'll have the new process in place. Possibly just have the plan and have the stuff on order, right? So I go to my office and I study up. We had the internet by then. I study up on this powder paint thing, and I get some quotes, and I do an NPV, and it turns out that it's going to be slightly negative. Do I accept or reject?
Yeah.
Accept. And here, why?
Because you have to.
You have to. And when you get right down to it, it's not just the cash flows of that project that are going to be impacted. If I don't, they're not going to let us keep making truck suspensions, right? Because no one wants to buy an unpainted truck suspension. They rust. And so we've kind of got to do this if we want to stay in business. And it's the same way when you have these safety things. We had to put up guardrails. It turns out if you're more than 3 feet off the ground, you got to have a freaking guardrail. Who knew, right? And so we have to do this. It's a negative NPV project unless we made the assumption that someone was going to fall off and get paralyzed or whatever, right? We couldn't really do those numbers and justify it. Long story short, there are negative NPV projects that you will have to accept in this life, and it's the ones usually imposed upon you by the government. Questions? Okay, let's go now and look at the nightclub. So if you don't have a calculator out, go ahead and get it out. CF, second clue work. What do I put in for CF0 for the nightclub? 1,000, negative, enter, arrow down. What do I put in for C01? 450, enter, arrow down. What do I put in for F01? 3, because there are 3 of those cash flows in a row. Now, what button do I hit next to get the IRR? The IRR button, very good. Okay, now what button do I hit? Compute. Now I want you to write this number down, 16.65%. 16.65%. How does that compare to the IRR of the snow cone stand? It's less, right? Now, by the way, is it still a standalone? Is it an acceptable project? Yeah, because 16.65 is greater than 10%, which was our discount rate, so we would accept this project. But if I have a choice between 23.375% and 16.65% for my investment, which one would you naturally gravitate to?
Higher.
Yeah, the higher one, right? Okay, now let's see what happens when we look at NPV. So we're going to hit NPV. We're going to put in our 10 for I, arrow down, and compute. NPV is 119.08. Go ahead and write that down, 119.08. What was the NPV of the snow cone stand?
2434.
2434. What's the goal of financial management? Maximize shareholder wealth. Given that we cannot accept both of these projects because they are mutually exclusive, in order to maximize shareholder wealth, which one of them would I choose? Yeah, you choose the nightclub, right? Because it's got a higher NPV. We know it's going to do more to increase shareholder wealth. Therefore, the goal of financial management tells us we would accept the nightclub. Now, why did IRR mislead us here? And it comes back to something I mentioned last time. IRR is only concerned about the relative size of the cash flows. The relative size of the cash flows that come back versus what you invest. And so it doesn't matter whether you invest 4 million, you're going to get 2 million, 2 million, 2 million, that's 23.375%, or negative 100, 50, 50, 50, you're going to have exactly the same IRR. IRR fails to consider the scale of the project. IRR fails to consider the scale of the project. And why does that matter? It matters because we are only able to invest 100 in the snow cone stand, but we are able to invest 1,000 in the nightclub. And I would rather have a 16.65% return on 1,000 than a 23.375% return on 100.
Well, if it's percentage based, if you put 500 on the nightclub, that would make it 50%, just like A is 50%. Right? So would it come out to the 23.375 then?
Oh, you mean 900. If I made it negative 900 for the first cash flow. Because remember, the reason it comes out to be 23.375% is because the first cash flow is negative and twice what the next three are.
So it's not the percentage of the cash flow based on the initial investment?
Well, the initial investment is going to impact
Sure.
what your percentage is.
Well,
I'm not sure where you're going.
So if you got 100 on A, $50 is 50% on the cash.
Oh!
If you got 1,000 on B, then 500 would be 50% on the cash flow.
Okay, you're saying if we would bump cash flows 1, 2, and 3 up to 500. Yeah, absolutely. And it would be lovely if we could just do that in life, figure out how to improve our future cash flows just like by snapping our thumbs. But can we?
I know you're the finance expert.
Let me tell you, it's damned hard, right? Because do you think that we looked through and thought of every possible way that we could to make this nightclub, to figure out all the ways we could make money at the nightclub? Yeah. I mean, we're going to have all sorts of stuff. Of course, you're old enough to remember cigarette vending machines.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we can throw in all sorts of stuff here to try to make money, but people that are going to do that, they're going to sit down and try to figure out what are all the cash flows, right? And so after the numbers are in, it's not the time to be starting to say, well, what if we could make 50 more? Right?
Because I guess you got to have a crystal ball at that point, right?
Yeah, well, and we kind of have to have a crystal ball anyway. Remember, we're talking about swags?
That's true.
Yeah. Oh, man, the uncertainty just kills people. And it kills people even more when you have to put money out. And it kills you even more when you have to put your own money out. So when I play poker, if we're just playing chips, right, and there's no real money involved, I'm a badass. What do you think happens to my game as soon as it's actually my real money?
You're folding.
Couldn't win on a bet, right? But then it would be a bet, right? So it's scary, right? Why do you think there are only a handful of people that are really competent at being CEOs? This stuff's hard. And you have to be, first of all, sure of yourself. By the way, do you think CEOs are sure of themselves?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think they're always right about
Pretty
that?
smart.
No.
Just
Okay. I'm sorry I don't have a brilliant and correct answer for you. Things are squishy. Okay. Yeah, just mathematically, you're absolutely correct. If it said 500, 500, 500, then the return, the IRR would be 23.375. And the NPV would also be higher. Okay, now let's ask this question. We know that if we can only accept one, that we're only going to accept the second one because the NPV is higher, because that maximizes shareholder wealth. What if these projects turned out to be independent after all? What if we could do both? What would your decision be then? You'd like to do 2 nights, okay. That's not what we're doing here. What would you do? We accept them both, right? If they're not mutually exclusive, what's the rule? Accept all positive NPV projects, right? And by the way, yes, if I could replicate the nightclub all the way across the country, you're absolutely right, you'd do that. Okay, questions? By the way, is there such a thing as growing too fast? Absolutely. You can take a look at things like, Quiznos. Oh my goodness. So they go out there and they're like trying to expand like really, really fast. And you can see this over and over again, people trying to expand too fast. And how do you get the money to expand too fast? Borrow it. And what's the problem with borrowing money?
It costs money.
It costs money and it's a fixed amount. And so in the meantime, while you're trying to get your restaurant spun up, those interest payments are due, right? Oh yeah, a lot of bankruptcies in the franchising business as a result of trying to grow too fast. Okay, so we've discovered one problem with IRRs, the mutually exclusive project. And now we're going to find another problem. It's called multiple IRRs. Remember, the definition of IRR is the NPV the discount that makes NPV equal to 0. It turns out that if you have a certain pattern of cash flows, you can have more than one place where the NPV is equal to 0. And then you can start getting some really funky answers out of IRR. Now let's talk about what kind of pattern of cash flows we're talking about. It's more than one sign change. If you have more than one sign change, you can have problems. Let's talk about the names for these things. In conventional cash flows, you start off with negative, and it could be more than just times 0. It could be times 0, times 1, and times 2, negative, but then it switches to positive, and it stays positive for the rest of the life of the project. We call those conventional cash flows. Conventional cash flows. That's where we only have one sign change from negative to positive. That's a conventional cash flow. Some projects, unfortunately, have what are called unconventional or non-conventional cash flows, and that's where we have more than one sign change. For example, we've got Project C here. Project C, in year 0, we're going to have to invest 100, and time 1, it'll bring us 230, but then we have another cash flow at time 2 that is a cash outflow. Let me explain to you how these cash flows happen in the real world. In the United States, we have coal mining, and the way that we do coal mining in the United States is through something called strip mining. And the way strip mining works is you go in, and instead of putting a hole in the side of the mountain and getting the coal out from the inside like my wife's grandfather did, instead of that, what they do is they push the top of the mountain off and they scoop the coal out. Now, it takes a whole lot fewer people, it's a whole lot safer. And it all sounds good until you hear that at the end of this all, the United States government is going to force you to rebuild the mountain. The United States government is going to force you to rebuild the mountain. Now, think about this. At time 0, part of that time 0 cash flow out is us knocking the mountaintop off. Does gravity help us or hurt us when we're knocking the top of the mountain off? It's going to help you because that crap's going to run downhill, right? Now, what do you think that means for when we rebuild the mountain? Gravity's working against us, so that's going to be expensive to rebuild the mountain. Another example of this is a gas station. Let's say that you decide you're going to open a convenience store, and you go out and you build your convenience store. In the beginning, you're going to bury the tanks, you're going to put the pumps in, you're going to build the store. That's going to be negative cash outflow, and then hopefully, as you sell gasoline, liquor, cigarettes, lottery tickets, those sorts of things, those are the big products at convenience stores, by the way, you're going to make positive cash flows, right? But at the end, when you decide, well, hey, I'm 65 years old, I'm decided I'm going to retire, and I'm just going to shut this station down. Do you know what the government requires you to do then?
Remove the tanks.
Yeah, you're going to have to remove the tanks. Now, why on earth would you have to remove the tanks?
They're hazardous.
They're hazardous. So here's what you need to know about the tanks at gas stations. They're made out of carbon steel. Carbon steel rusts. Eventually, carbon steel is going to rust enough that we have a leak. And so we know these tanks have a life on them, and we know if we just leave them in the ground, eventually they're going to leak and pollute the water table. And so we have to get them out of the ground. So what the government requires you to do is not only to pull those tanks out of the ground, but then you have to scoop the dirt out that was around the tanks, and you have to send it off to an incinerator where they burn it to get rid of any leaked gasoline, and then you bring it back and fill in the hole. Do you think that leads to a negative cash flow on the backside? Absolutely. Okay, so now I've proven to you that these kinds of cash flows exist. Let's see what they do to IRR and NPV. So get your calculator up. And we're going to say CF, second, clear work. What do I put in for CF0?
100.
100. And then what do I hit?
Negative.
Negative. Enter. Arrow down. What is C01? 230. Enter. Yeah, we're going horizontal instead of vertical.
Okay.
Don't let it freak you out. Arrow down, arrow down. What is C02?
132 negative.
132. Negative. Enter. Now, right now, I can hit IRR and compute. The IRR is 10%. If the discount rate for this project is 8%, would we accept or reject it?
Accept.
Yeah, we would accept it. If the discount rate were 12%, what would we do? Yeah, we'd reject it. Now I'm going to show you why that's perhaps a problem. But first thing I want to do, before we do that, I want you to hit your down arrow. Hit your down arrow, and then hit your up arrow. And notice that your calculator is only giving you one IRR. Okay, now if we go to NPV, and then I type in 10, enter for my interest rate, what should my NPV be? 0, right? Because IRR is the discount rate that makes NPV 0. And so I'm going to compute there, and sure enough, it comes out 0. So far, so good. Except for I'm going to show you something unsettling. Go back up, and instead of 10, put in 20. Enter, arrow down, compute. Negative 5 times 10 to the negative 13th. Let's talk about what negative 5 times 10 to the negative 13th would be. If it were negative 5 times 10 to the negative second, it would be negative 5 cents. And so what we're really talking about is, so it would be 0.05 if it were negative second, but instead it's going to be 0.00000000000. Oh, I'm running out of room. 5. It's darn near 0. Not exactly, but it's darn near 0. And what we do know is if I put in, let's say if I put in 21 for my interest rate. Then we have a negative NPV. So we know that basically the NPV, the profile reverses from being positive to negative. So we have a problem here. So how are we going to solve this? We are going to do an NPV profile. We're going to do an NPV profile. Actually, the way we're going to solve this is whenever you see cash flows like this, you're always going to use NPV. When you see cash flows like this, you're always going to use NPV. You'll never use IRR. Well, let me demonstrate to you here the problem. If we go ahead and figure out for all these different discount rates, and that's what's on the horizontal axis. For all these different discount rates, we figure out what NPV is. And we see that NPV is actually negative at discount rates below 10%, positive for discount rates between 10 and 20%, and negative again for discount rates greater than 20%. Remember earlier I said if the discount rate was 8%, would you accept or reject the project? You all said accept. Here's the problem. If you look up here at 8%, the NPV at 8% is actually negative. And so it's going to give us the exact opposite decision of what we should have had. Also, we said if the discount rate were 12%, we said we would have rejected it. But look up here, 12% is actually a positive NPV, which tells us to accept the project. And so IRR is leading us to bad decisions in the presence of unconventional or non-conventional cash flows. So the two big problems with IRR, number one, mutually exclusive projects. Number two, unconventional or non-conventional cash flows. And what are unconventional or non-conventional cash flows? More than one sign change. More than one sign change. So you notice in our example here, we had our first sign change going from 0 to 1, and our second one going from 1 to 2. That's 2 sign changes, means you're going to have 2 IRRs. This is the way math works. What would you think would happen if we had 3 sign changes? We would have 3 IRRs. For every sign change, you're going to have an additional IRR. In other words, an additional place where the NPV profile crosses 0. Now, your calculator will not tell you that second number, the 20%. And you're probably thinking in your head, how would I figure that out? I will show you when we're in Excel in Chapter 8. I will show you how to figure that out. And if I don't, remind me. I'd be glad to show you. Go ahead.
So for each new IRR you have like it's going over the x-axis?
Yeah, it's crossing the x-axis every time that we have a new IRR, because the x-axis, the NPV is 0, right? That's the 0 level.
So are we going to be like modeling that some sort of waveform in Excel?
We will not do that.
But
So
can you?
we could, yeah. In fact, I'm working on a study right now where I'm working on a model to predict women's as on board members being the optimal number of women to have on a board, which is, depending on the answer that I get, may or may not lead to the study getting published, right? So, I'm figuring out a function that fits the data. Questions? No, we're not going to get that fancy in here. I will show you a pick and blowtorch method.
What do we use IRR for?
What do we use IRR for?
I mean, if it's not accurate, why bother?
Oh, we'll get there. You know I'll tell you. We're not done yet. Other questions? Oh, very good. Do you see the next slide, Mr. Nylon? Why do people still use it? Well, first of all, it sums up the project in a single number, and it's a number that people have a feel for. It's similar to an interest rate. Raise your hand if you're a marketing person. Do you know who tends to end up being the CEO at the firm? You think it's the finance guy? No, it's the marketing person. First of all, finance people, we tend to not like other people, which kind of limits your ability to, be promoted. Also, the marketing people are the ones that are supposed to be looking out on the horizon at the opportunities. It gives them a bigger view of what we're doing. And so they're better at this whole strategic decision-making thing than, say, an accountant would be. Now, here's my next question to you, my marketing people. 20 years from now, when you're CEO, will you remember net present value? Be honest. Ms. Lee.
Yeah, I hope so.
She hopes so. She's an optimist. By the way, we've said that's a mark of marketing people, right? They're optimists. Okay, my point to you is this. Typically, the CEO is not going to be a great financial thinker. They may not remember NPV, but here's what they do know. I had a mortgage on my house for 7%. My retirement is making 12%. They'll have these numbers in their heads. And then you're going to come to them with a project that has an IRR of 19%. Does that sound good to them? Yeah, it lets them figure out, versus these other things, what the return is like. Now, you got to be careful here, because you only want to share the IRR with the marketing CEO if the NPV is positive. Let's say that this 19% IRR project actually should require 24% because it's just so risky. When you go to the CEO, the marketing CEO, and you say, this thing's got a 19% IRR, but it's negative NPV, so we shouldn't do it. And then he's like, or she's like, are you crazy? 19%? That's freaking great, right? So do not reveal the IRR to the marketing CEO unless it supports what you're trying to say. Does that make sense?
And again, we're doing that because it's in percentage.
Yeah, because, well, think about this. Have you ever borrowed money to buy a car?
Sure,
Do you remember what the interest rate was?
yeah.
If I told you that something was going to return 3 times that much, would it give you a positive feeling about it?
Well, me, I'm figuring out the number because I want the dollar amount.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Are you a marketing guy?
No.
Exactly. Okay, now, the next thing is, if the IRR is high enough, you might not even have to find the appropriate discount rate. If I tell you that replacing the company pickup truck has an IRR of 45%, do we even need to know whether the discount rate is 7% or 11%? The only way I can see you needing a higher IRR than 45% is if you're using the company truck to smuggle drugs over the border, right? If you're taking a risky thing, if you're doing, or you're like monster truck, maybe, right? But just for general around town type pickup truck use, you don't need to know the discount rate. By the way, is finding the discount rate easy? Think back to chapter 12, right? That's where we learned to find the discount rate. It's a big old pain in the butt. Does that help answer your question why people still use IRR?
I mean, I hear what you're saying, but for me, it just wouldn't, I always want to know, like, if I could go in there and like, using the car example again, I don't want them to give me APR.
You don't
Tell me
want
how, I don't want the APR. I want you to tell me how much am I gonna have to pay you for that money?
Oh,
So that's why I figured out.
Yeah.
Now. So, you know, you don't have to tell me it's 8%. You just need to tell me it's gonna be $6,500 on the end, but I'm paying you back. I don't like that, so.
okay. So let's take what Mr. Nylon has said here and explain to you how car dealers can rip you off.
Big time.
So here's what happens. You go into the car lot and you are negotiating. By the way, you always negotiate the price first, right? Well, they're like, well, how are you going to pay for this? And I'm like, you don't worry about that. You just shoot me the best deal you can and realize that I could buy this freaking Nissan Altima at 3 other places within a 20-minute drive, right? So shoot me the best price that you can. I'm only giving you one shot. By the way, I'm teaching you auto negotiation here. You've got one freaking shot to get this right, pal. I'm getting quotes from 2 other people. You get the number right. And then we'll talk about financing. So they're going to shoot you back a number. Let's say it's $40,000. Now you say, okay, let's talk about financing. And he's like, well, I got a deal for you. I can get you this 2.5% APR. By the way, does 2.5% APR sound good right now? Yeah. And then he's like, and then he shoots you, what's the payment going to be? And you say, yeah, I can handle that payment. Oftentimes they're lying to you about what the actual APR is. What do? You pull out your TI BA2 Plus, because you all know how to use it, and you figure out what the APR actually is based on the payment that he's giving you. It was so funny. One of my colleagues down in Mississippi, he had the misfortune of having a lot of kids. One of them came about as a result of Hurricane Katrina, but I digress. So he goes down to buy a minivan, which is like the sweatpants of the automotive world. And he goes down to buy a minivan, and the guy gives him the spiel. And he tells him what this APR is going to be. And my colleague reaches into his blazer pocket and pulls out his TI BA2 Plus. The guy nearly wets his pants, right? He says, without even having to touch the keyboard, he lowered down what that estimated payment was going to be. He said $1,500 basically was what he saved by just pulling his TI BA2 Plus up. Now what does this mean for you? Number one, we care about both, the payments and the interest, because we're going to see if they're lying to us. Number two, always take your TI BA2 Plus with you to the car lot. Even if you've forgotten how to use it, you can use it just to strike fear into their greasy little hearts, right? Does that help you out? Okay. Now let's talk about the Profitability Index, or PI. And we have this definition of PI. is the present value of cash flows subsequent to initial investment. What does subsequent to mean? After. So it's the present value of cash flows after the initial investment divided by the initial investment. Now I want you to notice that this formula assumes all investment happens at time 0. Write that down. Oh, actually, it's at the bottom there, isn't it? Okay. Now, here's something else to remember. We said that one of the ways you could define net present value is the present value of cash flows subsequent to initial investment minus the initial investment. So I could just take that formula and I can subtract NPV, or actually I can subtract initial investment from both sides, and I end up with initial investment plus, add initial investment to both sides. And I wind up with initial investment plus NPV is the same thing as the present value of the cash flow subsequent to initial investment. Since I've screwed this up so badly, I'm going to go ahead and write it on the board. NPV is equal to the present value of cash flows subsequent to initial investment minus initial investment. And so what do I do to get this thing by itself? I add initial investment to both sides. So NPV plus the initial investment is equal to the present value of the cash flows subsequent to initial investment. What that means, using the substitution principle, is that anywhere I see this thing, I can stick this thing. And that's exactly what I've done in the second equation. I just used the substitution principle. And the cool thing then is we can do a little algebra. I can divide, I can go ahead and divide that out and figure out that it's actually initial investment over initial investment plus NPV over initial investment. What happens to initial investment over initial investment?
Cancels.
It cancels out and becomes 1. And then we have, finally, and by the way, this is the formula I would put on your note sheet. This is the formula I would put on your note sheet. Profitability index is equal to 1 plus NPV over initial investment. I want you to make a note here. We tend to think of initial investment as being negative when we do the cash flows. But for purposes of profitability index, the initial investment is positive. For purposes of the profitability index, the initial investment is positive. For purposes of the profitability index, the initial investment is positive. If you put it in there as negative, you will always get the wrong answer. Okay, now let's talk about what this means. How are we going to come up with our rule for PI? It turns out that we can actually develop the rule for PI from the rule for NPV. What's the rule for NPV?
Accept all positive NPV.
Yeah, accept all positive NPV projects. If I put any positive number in there for NPV, and I've got my positive initial investment, that thing over on the right-hand side is going to be greater than 0. And so when I say 1 plus anything greater than 0, I'm going to come up with a number that's greater than 1. And so our rule is we accept all projects with PI greater than 1. Now you're saying, wait a minute, why are we doing this? Because if we had NPV to begin with, don't we already know whether to accept or reject the project? And this is when we start talking about the special use case for the profitability index. But first, let's ask about the ingredients. The ingredients, of course, are exactly the same things that you need for NPV, because after all, the thing contains NPV, and it doesn't contain anything more than NPV, because after all, we need an initial investment for our NPV calculation anyway. So, first of all, let's ask, does it account for the time value of money? Yeah, because you're looking at the present value of the cash flow subsequent to initial investment. Number 2, does it account for the riskiness of the cash flows? Yes, how?
Or discounted?
Yeah, the discount rate. And number 3, does it provide information regarding the wealth created by the project? Raise your hand if you think yes. Yes. Raise your hand if you think no. Very good, you're both right. It's like I, R. Here's the problem. It does tell you whether or not the project creates value. If it's greater than 1, we know we're creating value. If it's less than 1, we know the project destroys value. However, we don't know how much. It's the same problem that we had with IRR. And in fact, this is a problem that PI shares with IRR that's going to lead to it not being suitable for mutually exclusive projects. And that is, it fails to consider the scale of the project. And the reason this one doesn't consider the scale of the project is because we divide by the initial investment, right? Okay. When is it useful? And the answer is during times of capital rationing. What is rationing? We usually associate it with what? Wars. Okay, and why during wartime are people rationing? And what kinds of things are they rationing?
Food, metal.
Food, gasoline. There was a man in my hometown that got rich during World War II selling black market gasoline. Later on, bought a Buick dealership and became the pillar of the community. But, you know, hey, we all make mistakes, right? Okay, now on with the story. Why do you have to ration that stuff?
Going toward the war effort.
Okay, so because we need the gasoline for the war, what does that create at home?
Shortage.
A shortage. We only have to ration when there's not enough to go around. Remember that NPV theory assumes that if you've got a positive NPV project, you'll always be able to get funding. And if that's true, then there's no need for rationing. If that's true, there's no need for rationing. And so it's when we've got a shortage of funding for base compared to the projects that we have. We cannot get enough money to invest in all of our positive NPV projects. And so remember when I told you about Halliburton and how we had scarce capital. We could have easily turned to something like this to help us figure out what projects we should do next, but instead we did the payback. Okay, so what do you do then? Well, the first thing you do for all of these positive NPV projects, by the way, do we even consider the negative NPV projects? No. Dump them unless they're safety related, and then you know you've got to do them. Okay, we're going to figure out PI for all of our NPV, positive NPV projects, and then we're going to rank them in descending order. What does descending mean? Getting higher or lower? Lower, right? So you're going from big to small here. And then you're going to start investing until you run out of money. So let's talk about our different projects here. Have I listed them in descending order? Yeah. If we had no capital constraints, would we invest in all of these projects? Absolutely. Okay, now let me tell you that we have $1 million that we are allowed to invest. First project, $200,000. Do we accept or reject? Yeah, we accept it. Now we've got how much money left? $800,000. Next project costs $400,000. Do we accept or reject? We do, because we have, it's greater than 1, and we have enough money to do it. Now, how much money do we have left? So we've spent $600,000, so we have $400,000 left. This next project, it looks pretty good. Would we accept or reject? Reject. Why? We don't have enough money, right? Now, does that mean that we just stop right there? No, we keep looking because there may be smaller projects on down here. I made the number come out easy, right? We've got a $400,000 project here. What do we do? Accept or reject? Accept it. By the way, these numbers darn well better include your 10% contingency. And here's why. We're taking this account all the way down to zero, right? Wouldn't it suck to get started on all these projects and end up getting toward the end of them and figure out you didn't have enough money to finish any one of them? So make sure you include your contingencies when you're doing this. Okay. Now, we say this gives us the biggest bang for the buck. It's giving us the highest return on the money that we can invest. So let me give you some examples on who might use this. First of all, startup firms. We discussed last time that startup firms, no one's just going to give them, or they shouldn't, just give them an endless amount of money. Have you guys heard of WeWork? Adam Neumann, what a moron. But he's like a con artist, and he manages to talk this Japanese guy into just basically writing him a blank check. Don't depend on that happening for you, right? Don't depend on that happening for you. More likely what's going to happen is the people that help you get capital to get started are going to be reluctant to provide you money. And so they may not provide you as much as you absolutely want. And so you need to look at the projects that you've got and come up with which one's going to give us the best bang for the buck, given that we have this limited amount of money. Okay, so startup firms, and then we have FEMA. Do you guys know what FEMA is? What's FEMA?
It's disaster relief.
Yeah.
Domestically.
I would think that Mr. Nylon, being from Mississippi, would know what FEMA is. What's FEMA?
Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Yeah, Federal Emergency Management, and it's either administration or agency, no one can ever remember, and it's all cool. Yeah. We all just call it FEMA. Now, what does FEMA do?
What we said, disaster relief.
Okay, so I'll give you an example. I moved to Mississippi right after Hurricane Katrina, 2005. Lots of stuff gets wiped out. What did FEMA do? First of all, they came in and they brought water and ice and food. By the way, why do you think the people needed ice?
It's hot.
It's hot, and what happens to food if you don't keep it cold? It spoils, and now you've got a bunch of hurricane refugees, and they all have diarrhea. Like that's another disaster you don't want to deal with. Okay, so they bring in this sort of stuff. They also bring in these FEMA trailers for people to live in whose houses have been washed or blown away. They also go around and they nail these blue tarps on the roof. Because it turns out the hurricane may blow the shingles off, and that leaves your house open to water damage. And so if you can get something to cover the roof, you can prevent further damage, right? Now, can FEMA prevent hurricanes? No. Can FEMA prevent tornadoes? By the way, FEMA came in after the Joplin tornado too, 2011. What about earthquakes? Can they prevent earthquakes? No. Can they prevent floods?
Yes.
How?
The locks and levee systems. all the
Okay,
city.
so that's actually the Army Corps of Engineers. They build these. By the way, environmentalists won't let us build those anymore because there might be some three-eyed fish that is only associated with this particular puddle, and it will be destroyed if we build the dam, right? So no more progress for us, but the good news is the three-eyed fish survives. Okay, so we're not going to be able to do that, but can we prevent the damage from floods? Here's what happens. By the way, do people like to live down by the river? Oh yeah. It's like, yeah, I got a cabin on the river. I can cast my line into the river from my back porch. I get to fish every night, and I don't have to drive home drunk because it's right there. Because you know he's drinking while he's fishing, right? Sounds great, right up until what happens?
Floods.
It floods. And then the house gets washed away. Now, thanks to our system of flood insurance in this country, when someone's house gets washed away, do you think the government comes up and says, sorry, Ms. Armbruster, you should have known better than to build down by the river, so good luck. Do you think that's the answer? No, we say, oh, you poor baby, you've lost your house in a flood. Here's a bunch of money. Rebuild your house. Now, Ms. Armbruster, she says, I sure do like living down here by the river. You know where, and I own this land already. What's she gonna do? She's gonna rebuild her house where?
A little bit higher.
If she were a bright person like Ms. Armbruster would, but most people won't,
Yeah.
right? And so they just build back where they were. And 5 years later, what happens again? Same damn thing. It's stupid. And so the government, instead of saying, hey, let's just let people suffer the consequences of their bad decisions, they say, let's go about this another way. Every year, Congress shall appropriate a certain amount of money. And this amount of money shall be used to prevent these flood situations. And how do they prevent them? We're going to buy up Ms. Armbruster's house. We know eventually it's going to flood. We know it's in the 5-year flood zone. It means it floods at least every 5 years. And so we're going to say, okay, we're going to buy out Ms. Armbruster. And what they do is they put out a request for proposals. And they say, if you know of one of these flood-prone properties in your area, you can propose buying it and tearing it down. Now, why do you think it's important to tear it down after you buy it?
The river's going to tear it down by itself.
The river's going to tear it down by itself, and then you've got all this crap floating down the river, probably taking out bridges and crap, because Ms. Armbruster's house is well built, right? And once it gets lifted up off of its foundation, whoo, there it goes downstream, right into the bridge pier, kind of like Baltimore. What else? What happens when you have empty, vacant buildings? Do they stay empty and vacant? Squatters. You get squatters in there, and squatters like to do a lot of different things. Are any of them healthy? No. Cooking methamphetamine is a really popular pastime in vacant houses. What about, they're called shooting galleries, where people come together to inject heroin, right? It's a great social activity. They all come together and lay there and, right? So there's all sorts of reasons that we don't want these vacant buildings around. Lonely teenagers looking for love. I mean, there's all sorts of people we would like to keep out. So we have to tear this down. And so here's what I do. And by the way, it's typically engineering agencies that do this. They locate the building, and then they write up the project, and then they get paid a percentage of the project in order to oversee it. And the only reason I know about this is because I was teaching this to my night class, and there was a guy sitting right here. And he's like, oh yeah, we use that. And he was actually, his company got funding to tear down the Little River Inn in Ozark. What do you think, where do you think the Little River Inn was located?
On the little river?
Oh, on the river, right? I think it was because it was little, not because the river was little. Do you remember the Little River?
Yeah, it's on the Finley,
It was on the Finley River.
which is hardly a river.
Yes,
Yeah,
but it's still flooded.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, all you got to have is a possibility of flood. Okay, now, where do the positive cash flows come from this to make it a positive MVP project? So for FEMA, think about FEMA. They're having to invest, let's say it's $2 million to buy this thing and tear it down. What's going to be the cash flow back in the other direction?
Donations?
Say again?
Donations?
No. Oh no, the government doesn't take donations except through your taxes, right? What else? How about avoiding replacing the house? You remember what I said we were going to do with Ms. Armbruster's house every time it flooded out? Oh, you poor thing. Here's another $500,000. She says, wait a minute. Real estate prices have gone up since the last time this happened. And I'm like, oh, you're right. Here's $850,000. Sorry for that. Right? Isn't that dumb? But It's the avoidance of future negative cash flows. By the way, do you think that avoiding a future negative cash flow is just as good as receiving a positive future cash flow? Absolutely. And in some ways it's better because it's after-tax money that you don't have to spend, right, as far as you as a business. So it's a good deal. Whew. Okay.
So these RFPs that you're talking about,
Yeah.
these businesses put in to go tear down these places, they're buying the place, or the government's buying the place?
The government will buy.
And they're putting an RFP to do the tear down.
Yeah, so the RFP says, okay, government, this is what it's going to take for you to buy the property. This is what it's going to take to tear it down, and this is our fee. And that's all going to be that initial investment. And the government's putting all this money out there. Now, let's think about how then, what happens after everybody does their request for proposals. By the way, one of the things they say in the request for proposal is that you must calculate the profitability index. You must calculate the profitability index. And then you write it in the upper right-hand corner of your RFP. I'm making this part up, but I'm picturing it in my head. So you write and then what happens? You mail that off to Washington, D.C., and undoubtedly some sort of unpaid intern is sitting in a desk. And they put those things in descending order. And they say, okay, well, we've got our $50 million. We're going to work through these until we have blown through the $50 million. And so they do that, and they select projects this way until they run out of money. And then for the remainder of the projects that have a PI greater than 1, they send a letter that says, sorry, we ran out of money this year. Please feel free to resubmit next year, right? Because maybe Congress will give more money next year. Who knows? Questions? By the way, what do you think is more personally satisfying, building things or tearing them down? Viscerally, right now, tearing them down. Long-term mental health, building brings you far more joy than tearing down. Okay, now let's talk about PI and how it can lead to bad decisions. I've told you, you can't use it for mutually exclusive projects, and here's why. Remember the NPVs we talked about earlier. I believe they were 24.34 for Project A and 119.8 for Project B. If we take our 24.34 and divide by our initial investment of 100, remember we got to make it positive. That means we've got 0.2434, we add 1. The profitability index for the first project would be 1.2434. Is that right? Okay, so go ahead and write that down, 1.2434. Now the second one is 119.08 in PEV. 119.08 divided by 1,000 gives us 0.11908. And we add 1, that gives us a profitability index of 1.11908. So what's bigger, 1.2434 or 1.11908? Yeah, the first one, right? If we used profitability index to choose between these two projects, we would be choosing Project A. But we know that's not right because Project A has a smaller net present value, and the goal of financial management is to maximize shareholder wealth. So we would choose the larger NPV. Now, why does it lead to these bad decisions? It's exactly the same reason that IRR does, and that is because this thing fails to account for the scale of the project. It fails to account for the scale of the project, which is why we don't use it unless we have capital rationing. So what happens in the real world? Some finance professors went out and they did a survey of the top financial thinker at a bunch of firms. And they talked to small firms and large firms. And by the way, how do they define small and large? Probably they took their sample and they divided it in half at the median and said, this bunch are the small ones and this one are the big ones. And they asked these people, they had a survey. And they said, we want you to rank from 0 to 4, where 0 is never and 4 is always. How often do you use each of these decision rules? And then they took those numbers, the surveys, and they came up with averages. They found averages for large firms and averages for small firms, and they're reported here. Now, I want you to notice that the two most popular measures are IRR and NPV. And I want you to notice that they're statistically indistinguishable as far as their popularity. And the answer for why that is, if you had enough information to calculate IRR, you have enough calculation to do NPV, and vice versa, right? Because they got the same ingredients. And when I show you an example from chapter 8, we're going to see just exactly how easy it is to come up with IRR after you've done your NPV analysis. So usually, if people are doing NPV, they're also doing IRR. Now, who does these more often, the large firms or the small firms? Well, it's going to be the large firms. Any ideas why that is? There's at least a couple of reasons.
More employees, more time.
Say it again, Mr. Utect.
More employees and more time to do it.
Okay, so and I'm going to go with the more employees thing here. A large company, so let's start when you're a small company. You're an entrepreneur, you're on your own. In the beginning, do you hire any financial professionals at all? No, it's just you, your lawnmower, and TurboTax. Eventually, things get complex enough. Who's the first financial professional you hire? An accountant, right? Are accountants big on these things? Not as much as we are. Eventually, though, your company gets large enough, you're going to go out there and hire yourself a finance person, and that's when these things are going to pop up. So that's the people angle, is that accountants get hired before finance people, and in the beginning, they don't use either one. Now, what about, what kind of projects do we say that payback was good for?
Really small.
Small projects. Now think about small projects, small companies and large companies. Who's more likely to have large projects? The large company, right? Small company, I'm trying to figure out whether or not I should buy another $250 3D printer, right? And meanwhile, General Electric is thinking about whether I should build another battery electric facility, right? Huge difference in the scale. It would be insane for me to do NPV analysis on my $250 3D printer, right? Because if I value my time, and I need to update my time value. I value my time at $200 an hour. And I know we've had inflation, so let's say 300. If it's going to take me more than an hour to do it, it's cheaper just to buy the darn printer, right? And I could probably figure it out via payback. And so what I'm telling you is that those are the two reasons that large companies are more likely to use NPV and IRR. Number one, they're more likely to have a financial thinker involved. And number two, they're likely to have the projects that are big enough to justify using NPV. Because after all, a proper NPV analysis could cost you $10,000, $15,000, right? It could be pretty expensive. By the time you include all the time of the people involved, it really can get that expensive. Okay, now let's move on down to the payback method. Payback method is more popular at small firms than large firms. Why? For the same reasons. Small firms are more likely to have small projects, which we said was good with payback. And also, the financial thinkers are few and far between at the small place. So with small projects and lack of financial sophistication, what are they going to do? Payback. In fact, when you talk to small business people, you'll often hear them say, well, it's going to take me 4 years to break even on that. They're not even thinking of payback as a rule. There's just generally, they're like, well, I'm going to buy this for $100,000 and it's going to give me $25,000 per year. Well, hell, it'll take me 4 years to pay for that thing, right? Have you ever heard that? That's payback. That's why you see it at small firms.
So how are we defining small and large? Are we defining it by the fact that they have an accountant and a finance guy, or are we defining it by how much money they make, whether they're public or not?
I'm going to ask someone who was listening. Ms. Coulter, how did I say they likely divided this sample into large and small? Yeah. Typically, what we do is we get these and we look at size and we take the median. The median is the point at which 50% of the firms are larger and 50% are smaller, and we'll use that as a dividing line.
Okay, but I mean, instead of telling what you're using for the median, the number of people, the revenue.
So typically, what we're talking about, and they may have done it more than one way. I mean, you can the citations here if you want me to go pull it. Typically, we're talking about either total assets, total revenue, or the market value of equity. And typically, whenever I do a study like this, I'll use one of those measures to begin with, and then I'll do the other two and show that the results are robust to different considerations of measures of size.
So there's several different categories.
Oh, hell yes. Nothing's ever easy.
Yeah, I would hope it would be simple.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. I'll try to hunt this article down and I'll send it to you, and then you can try reading it and tell me if you actually figure it out.
Okay.
Yeah. By the way, if you don't enjoy reading, so my Fin 790 seminar is great for people who think they might want to be a professor, because it is like a doctoral research seminar light. And it's light because the papers I'm having you read are not the most complex, and they're not the newest using the most crazy out there methods, right? If you can stand to read those papers and you still want more, doctoral school may be for you. How many, in a class this size, how many of you would I expect would be suitable for doctoral school? 0, right? Because typically we're talking about low percentages, right? You raised your hand. Are you interested in a PhD?
Yeah.
Okay, well, come by and talk. I'll try to dissuade you. By the way, PhD, I did it 4 years. More typical is 5. In fact, it's almost unheard of for anyone to do 4 years anymore. And then you got to try to get tenure. That takes, if you get it on your first place, that takes you 6 years. So now we're up to an 11-year commitment. Let's say you get through with your MBA when you're 24. That means by the time that you are financially secure enough to think about maybe starting a family, you're already starting to push that biological barrier, right? You ever wonder why you see so many professors without kids? That, and we can see the future and we know it's terrible. Okay, long story short, let's get back to this. By the way, discounted payback, dog with fleas. I was so thrilled to see it not ranking very highly here. Now let's get to the accounting rate of return. Even lower, but still more popular at small firms because the first professional you hire is an accountant, right? Now, finally, Profitability Index, not used very much at all. This is a victory. By the way, these are all American companies. This is a victory for the American financial markets. Because in this country, usually, if you have a good project, you can get funding. I was given this talk, and there was a lady sitting right here from Haiphong. Ms. Nguyen, where is Haiphong? What country is it? North of Vietnam. Vietnam, the banks are all owned by the government. And when you go to try to get money for your business, is it easy? No. Especially if you're not, let's say you're not a member of the Communist Party. Yeah, you don't have any connections, and the other thing is you're not a state-owned enterprise. So you're just someone who's come up with a better way to plant rice, right? Now, when you go to the government bank, who are they more likely to loan to? The non-party member who is not a state-owned enterprise, or the state-owned enterprise where they know the government will make sure that they pay their bills, plus, by the way, these are my friends from the party. I see them at all the parties, right? And so this young lady from Haiphong, she was sitting there shaking her head, no, no, no. She says, it's hard to get money. I said, it's hard to get money in your country. And so some of the rest of you may be from countries that don't have as well-developed financial systems. Taiwan, fairly well-developed financial markets. Mongolia, maybe not so much. Does that make sense? Yeah, and so you may, in Mongolia, do you have to be friends with people in order to get money? Yeah, okay. So what I'm telling you is, if you are in Mongolia, or Taiwan, not Taiwan, let's see, who else did it? Guatemala? Yeah, maybe you'll find profitability index more important in your life than you would if you lived in the United States. Questions? By the way, if you find yourself in one of those situations where you need to be friends with people in order to get financing, what should you do?
Move to another country.
It's not easy. Make friends, right? You make friends. Now, should you, like, bribe people?
Maybe.
I'm not going to recommend that. I'm not. When I worked in the oil field, so it was especially Nigeria. Who's Nigerian here? Anybody from Nigeria? In Nigeria, if we wanted to get our stuff out of the port up to the field camp, we had to pay what was called a facilitating payment. By the way, what's a facilitating payment? It's a bribe that's legal under the 1977 Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So here's how it works. The quartermaster for the port, the harbor master, he has a brother-in-law. And this brother-in-law has an expediting business. Do you know what the expediting that he does for you is? You give him money, and he expedites your order. And so that's all clean from an American perspective. But what's happening in the background in Nigeria? Brother-in-law keeps half, gives half to the harbor master, everybody's happy. Did we have friends in Nigeria? Absolutely. Am I telling you to bribe people? Absolutely not. See you next time.